Hello, I'm Andrew Edwards. It's our Big Yorkshire phone-in, hour 3 today, asking whether you've written a will, and if you have, is it still up to date and in order? I asked this in November, Will Aid Month, which means that solicitors who are taking part in it will write your will without charge with their fees going to the Will Aid charities, and we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But I'd love to get your questions for our guest who I'll introduce in a moment, your queries, and as always, it's best if you give us a call and we can have a chat. 0345 303 3333. So I suppose, if nothing else, it might focus your mind on getting your affairs sorted out, fully up to date. If you don't have a will or it's out of date, it can lead to all kinds of complications and problems. Delighted to welcome Mark Cannon from Applebys Solicitors in Bradford. Nice to see you, Mark. How are you?
Good afternoon.
Due to being a bear of small brain, I should make a slight confession. I actually gave you the name of the company, which the company may like. I mean, they may think that's a good thing. I called you earlier Mark Appleby, but yeah, it's a step too far. So it's Mark Cannon. Mark specialises in wills, probate and estate planning. But this intrigues me. You're also a Church of England vicar.
I am, yes.
Which came first?
Vicaring came first. I've been a vicar for 30 years, starting in Bradford and then moving up to the Lake District, ending up in North Lancashire.
And where did the lawyering fit in then?
I had a midlife crisis at 40 and got bored with being a vicar and decided I'd train to be a lawyer. And then I did conveyancing and thought I should have stayed with being a vicar, really.
Really?
so I mix the two now. So
that's a very honest answer. And I'm thinking there might be, to use that awful word, a bit of synergy between being a vicar and being somebody specialising in wills as a lawyer.
I am your one-stop shop for death.
So what a cheerful way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, practically speaking, how does it work? Is being a lawyer during the week the day job, and then what do you do? You fill in for other people at the weekends, do you?
No. I've got 6 churches in the Dales. Yeah. So
wow.
Only little ones and not many people going, so it's not.
But that's still more than enough to keep a fella going, isn't it?
Really? I've got 2 nuns to help me. So,
and do you now find that the mix of doing the 2 different things works well for you then?
It does. It is good. Because I think when you're dealing with people's wills and probate, it does help to have knowledge of death and bereavement and counselling and be able to relate to people who are often distressed.
Yeah, and you're very well used to speaking to people, which is a lot. It's a huge part. I mean, you need the expertise, clearly. You wouldn't want to go to somebody about your will who didn't know what they were talking about, but it's the other side of it, I think. Yeah. I mean, having had recently, sadly, to deal with all too many wills of people in my own family, as you say, it's tricky, and you suddenly, I didn't know where my dad's will was. You suddenly start looking for it. You say, goodness me, what's this? And you didn't know about something. And you thought, actually, it was rewritten after that. And it is so important. We all know it's important, but we don't necessarily get on with it, do we?
People don't want to make a will.
What's that about?
I think if people sign a will, they reckon they're asking for it. That's it. Done now. Take me away, Lord. That's it. There's a psychological barrier, I think, to saying I've sorted my affairs. I'm ready to go. Yeah. So
I'll get my confession out of the way early, which is when we bought our house, needed to make a will, which we did. Yeah. So both of us made wills, and they are pretty much what you call mirror wills. So, that's that. The only snag is our daughter, who turns 17 next year, doesn't feature in that will.
Right.
So I'm feeling a bit guilty sitting here even speaking to you.
At 17, she'll be able to pretty much choose her guardian. The courts will take account of her wishes, and she probably has an idea of which.
So, but you're talking about really important things. So, were we to be, were my other half and I to be out for the evening, and heaven forbid, have a car crash and not walk out from that? You're talking not only about who gets the prize bit of furniture, but you are talking about really fundamental things like guardianship.
It is who looks after your children for you, who cares for the money for them, who brings them up, who decides on their education and lifestyle choices, all those things.
And if we're talking about small children particularly, that's a really big deal, isn't it?
It's a huge deal, yeah. And I suppose, again, it's something nobody likes to think about.
So we'll talk about that. We'll answer a question, which is about who can make a will. And Will Aid Month. Now, I have to say that I find that quite intriguing. And people are made the crack. People always make cracks about lawyers and their fees. But this genuinely, if a solicitor's firm is participating in this, you get your will made. Yep. But the fee...
It's not even as bad as the fee. We do the will for nothing. You choose to make whatever size donation you want to Will Aid. and Will Aid distributes the money to the 9 charities.
And I was having a look at the list. So last year, Will Aid raised more than £1 million for its partners. Action Aid, Age UK, British Red Cross, Christian Aid, NSPCC, Save the Children, Sight Savers, and then a couple of charities specific to Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
So not inconsiderable amount of money.
No, it's good.
Very good. So, your questions. You've heard him. This is Mark Cannon. He is a solicitor specialising in wills, probate and estate planning. He's also, if you've got any questions about the other side of his work, he's Church of England Vicar, as you've heard, 0345 303 3333. And we are here for you. So, I've got plenty I want to ask Mark, but I'd like it to be stuff that you want the answers to. So, 0345 303 3333. When you call, and don't hang on, don't wait for someone else, just get in there. When you text, it's 81333 with the word Leeds at the start. Email will be great for this, actually, andrew.edwards@bbc.co.uk. But let's start on Twitter. Stephen says, is writing your own will still legal, and what is the process?
Yes, you can write your own will, and there's no problem with that at all. The tricky thing is getting the formalities of the will correct. So getting the right number of witnesses, the right signature, signing in the presence of witnesses, and so on. But no, you can buy a will pack from W.H. Smith and you can have a go yourself, and it's a source of income for solicitors because so many mistakes can be made while doing that.
Isn't that interesting? So in the end, people buy the pack, and I'm sure other stationery providers are available, but you do that, but then people find out it's not quite as simple as it looks.
And it's a big risk.
You're sure you're not saying that as a lawyer?
I'm not. It is a big risk doing it yourself when you could, for not a huge amount of money, get a professional to do it for you.
Do you sometimes, well past the event, because the person in question has died, do you find that actually there are holes literally in wills?
We find we have wills that are invalid when they've been incorrectly drafted and signed. Because
they, for example, haven't had the witnesses?
Exactly, or the witnesses have not been together when the will has been signed.
And that in law?
The law, it's gone, it's finished.
So then, that's an even messier situation then, isn't it?
It is. I mean, you're in what's called intestacy then, so that means the law applies to people who haven't written a will. And most of the time, it goes to a spouse and then children, and that's what most people want. But if you have a complex personal life, then the state deciding where your assets goes is not a good thing.
So, Stephen, the answer is yes, it is still legal to write your own will, and the process is you can probably go and get a pack or go online and find the information, but not probably quite as simple as it might seem.
You can write it on the back of a cornflake packet if you want.
Interesting. Executor of a will. Now, this is something, sadly, I've had all too much experience of recently. That's quite an important role, really, isn't it? Because I say my aunt, for example, who died, my aunt and uncle didn't have children. My uncle died not long after my aunt died. And she, I think, had made a very sensible decision, which was to have a nephew on either side of the family as her executors.
Yeah.
And so he and I ended up doing that. And we were, in a sense, speaking on behalf. But she actually left a very clear, very fair will, distributing the money between the different members of the family. But I felt quite a responsibility over that because you still have to make decisions. She had a flat which I was involved with the selling of, and it's a responsibility. And it seemed a distant day when she asked me, when I was probably in my early 20s, would I mind being her executor?
It's an onerous position to be an executor. There's quite arduous legal duty laid upon you to administer an estate, to make sure you've gathered everything in, that you distribute it correctly to the various people, and as you say, making decisions about selling houses and flats and what you do with the personal possessions and the books and the jewellery and the car and all the other bits and pieces. And if you make a mistake, you could be in trouble.
Yeah, interesting. This is Chris in Liversedge. Andrew, yes, I have made a will. Even my body is willed, and that often is the sort of medical research thing. I don't know if it is with Chris.
Yeah.
If ever things change, I'll go back to the same solicitor. They did a good job last time. That's Chris in Liversedge. Thank you, Chris. 22nd of November today. November is Will Aid Month, where participating solicitors will write your will without charge, and you make a donation to any number of charities. Last year, I'll read the list out before we finish this lunchtime, but more than £1 million went to the charity partners as a result of that. And we're taking your questions. So Mark Cannon of Applebys Solicitors in Bradford is here. He's also Church of England Vicar, as I mentioned, and we would love to get your questions. Nick in Keighley is our first caller for you this lunchtime, Mark. So Nick, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Not so bad, thank you.
Nice to
Setting
hear.
up with the weather being a bit colder than normal these days, but hey.
Yeah, and Keithley seems to have borne the brunt. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about this afternoon. What's the reason for your call, Nick?
Listening to Radio Leeds, as I always do, noted about the will situation. And what has happened is that my wife passed away about 4.5 years ago. And the upshot of it was that we left a property in trust for my children. And when I downsized the house, the residue funds would be accessible for me to use for ongoing maintenance and to continue living at the property, because I suffer from Parkinson's, so I can't work anymore, basically. And I've been trying now to try and get access to the residue funds. And apparently when the will was made, it was left, in the words of the solicitors who prepared it, deliberately vague to pick up ongoing expenses. And yet another clause in the will says that I'm not able to do so. So the will hasn't done what was intended to do, and that is to make clear what my wife's wishes were. And it now leaves me with this situation where there are funds which I have no access to, and the will technically is worthless, but because I can't appeal against the will now because it's 4.5 years down the line, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, it's left me disadvantaged and not sufficiently provided for.
Well, Nick, I'm very sorry to hear that. I'm sorry about your wife's death and also to hear about your situation, but clearly the money is vital. Well, Nick, meet Mark Callan from Applebys Solicitors in Bradford. It's a difficult situation, that, isn't it, Mark?
That's a very difficult situation. Good afternoon, Nick. It sounds as if the property was left so you could occupy it as long as you wanted.
Correct.
But it was the benefit of it, the value of it, was going to pass to the children.
Correct.
Right. And because you downsized, there is an extra sum of money now.
Yes.
That will also be controlled by the original will trust, I imagine.
Correct.
So, are you entitled to the income?
Well, one part of the trust says, quite specifically, any residue funds can be used to pick up ongoing expenses for the substitute property.
Yeah.
And then there is another clause, which I don't have in front of me, and this is because I didn't expect this.
Okay.
Says that subject to the preceding clause, I'm not able to access it because it's to be held in trust for my children.
Right.
So one contradicts the other.
They seem to, don't they? Yes. Yes.
Well,
who are the trustees?
Solicitors, and they tell me that I now have to either go to have trustees removed.
Yes.
My children are quite happy for things to happen as my wife had intended. But yet, the executor, or one of the executors, doesn't want anything to do with it. He says, no, it's going to be held, you're not getting a penny, end of story. The other trustee, who is a solicitor, I won't name, has resigned because he said he can't handle this. But it was his practice that prepared the will in the first place.
So you're caught in the middle here, and I don't want to go into any more detail than we have already for obvious reasons. But just on the principles that we're talking about, is there any way forward that you can see here, Mark?
I think Nick has the right idea. He needs the agreement of the beneficiaries, ultimately his children, and he needs to talk to the trustees. And it sounds like one of the executors is also a trustee.
Yes.
Yeah, and
None of them want to talk to me.
Right. Well, they can't not talk to you, if you see what I mean. You do have rights under this.
Who can help them talk to him, if you see what I mean?
At the risk of recommending more solicitors, Nick, which I'm sure, you've had a bad experience of that, but I think it is worth getting a second opinion from somebody who's well qualified in trust law. It's quite a specialist area. You know, it's very difficult from your own experience, but it doesn't sound like their refusal is the end of the road for you. But people would have to look at the original documents.
Can I just interject here?
Sure.
I've had 2 independent solicitors advise me that I have rights over this, and they are all wrong. Right. I've been advised by a colleague who is a retired judge, as it happens, and he says they can't do this. Oh. And the only advice I've been given by everybody is I have to go to court and have a court deal with this. And I'm now told it's going to cost me in excess of £20,000 to rectify this.
Oh, how awful at a time when you can't work and you need the money. Anything you can say. We're not going to go through chapter and verse on this, clearly, but, Nick seems to be caught in a complete catch-22 at the moment.
I think one of the blockages is the executor who's being difficult. Is he the only surviving trustee, or is there another?
No, he and one who has tendered his resignation, who is the solicitor who actually prepared.
So in effect, there's just the one trustee left. Certainly a new trustee needs to be appointed.
Well, there we are. I'm going to draw a line there under it, Nick, but my heart goes out to you, and I hope you can work your way through what sounds a bit of a legal quagmire at the moment, but I really appreciate the call, Nick, and I hope without spending a fortune when you need the money, you can find a way through.
I just wish that when a will is prepared, it would be quite precise. I think that's a lesson for everybody, that when wills are prepared, they must be specific and to the point.
Yes, leaving it helpfully vague was not something that really helped anyone in the end, was it, really?
Precisely.
Nick, I wish you well, and I appreciate the call. Thanks very much indeed. That's Nick in Keighley. Thank you, Nick. Talking about wills this afternoon, Mark Cannon is here from Applebys Solicitors in Bradford. He specialises in wills, probate and estate planning. He's also, as we've established, Church of England vicar, looking after, how many churches in the Dales did you say it was?
6.
6. Half a dozen churches. Look at that. How does he do it? Your questions in Will Aid Month, where solicitors will do, if they're participating, will do your will without charging you, and then you make a donation to one of a string of charities. I promised to read the list again. Last year, Will Aid raised more than £1 million for its charity partners: Action Aid, Aid UK, British Red Cross, Christian Aid, NSPCC, Save the Children, Sight Savers, and one charity specifically in Scotland and one in Northern Ireland. So there we are. That number is 0345 303 3333. You just wanted to come back on something we mentioned earlier. It was Chris in Liversedge who was praising the solicitor and saying he'd go back if he wanted to change anything. It may be a she. Yes, I have made a will. Even my body is willed. You just made an observation about that.
In effect, you leave your body to a medical school, and they may have enough already. So you may not end up where you want to be. On the other hand, you could always use your back garden and bury there. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. But you may devalue your property when you come to sell on, and you've left Granny under the vegetable patch.
Only a vicar and lawyer could get away with making an observation like that, but we will let him. Mark Cannon. Now, Nick in Rodley. That's interesting, though. So you may want to leave it, but the medical school in question may say, can you then say, I would like it to go anywhere in the country that may be relevant?
I think you can, but I don't think medical students use live bodies so often now. I think the demand has dropped. I think so, yeah.
Organ donation, of course, is a different thing altogether. So, well, fascinating. Chris, thank you very much indeed for that. So, Nick in Rodley says, Andrew, after the ruling last year where the estranged daughter challenged the will and benefited, there seems little point in bothering with one. OK, the circumstances may have been specific, but it's the fact that the challenge was upheld by the court that is the critical point here. The mother's wishes were not actually followed. Nick in Rodley. It's an interesting observation, isn't it?
It is, and I think largely the mother's wishes were followed, and that's the situation with the law on making a will. You can leave your assets to whoever you want, to charity or to your friends or whatever. That law has not changed. However, it's always possible for those who can prove that they might be dependent on you in some way to challenge your will and say that the will hasn't made reasonable provision for you. And I think in this particular case, you're right to point out, it's very dependent on the case. The daughter was on benefits, I believe, and it was a substantial sum going to charity, and I think the judge thought, well, the daughter should have something because it helps all the rest of us taxpayers.
And then Nick asks a very valid question, which is, well, does the will therefore have any value? Given that
it does, because your will, provided you take into account the legitimate expectations of other people, will stand. And it is, in fact, still very difficult for an adult to challenge a will. You can see that, obviously, if you made a will and your children weren't provided for and they were young, they would have a right to some kind of income. For an adult, it's more difficult to prove that.
If you've got a question for Mark Cannon, who's here for the next few minutes, now would be a really good time to call 0345 303 3333, talking about wills. He's a specialist in probate and estate planning as well as wills at Applebys Solicitors in Bradford. Let me just come back to the figures from the Will Aid charity. 53% of mums and dads have not prepared a will, and I was looking at the figures, 40,000 children bereaved of a parent each year, 110 a day. So if half of those parents haven't left a will, that leaves a number of really big problems potentially, doesn't it?
I didn't know those figures, Andrew. That's quite shocking.
It's shocking. It's really shocking.
Yeah. So
that
if
means
that's minor children, that's
and I suppose some parents might think, well, we don't have a lot of money, there's nothing to leave. But your argument was it's not just to do with money.
It's very important, because if you don't choose the guardians under a will, the state will appoint guardians to look after your children, and that might be people you wouldn't have chosen.
So you may say, for example, not want it to be your brother or sister. Yeah. You might want it to be your own mum to look after a child, or a friend, or whatever.
A godmother, godfather.
And that's not necessarily, if the court had no idea, the decision they'd make anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you've not made a will, somebody saying, they said, they really wanted me, that's not going to wash, is it?
Not at all. No.
0345 303 3333. We're going to try and squeeze in at least one more call. Ashley email said, Andrew, just had a wry smile on my face while you were talking to your legal beagle. Is his real surname Mark Cannon? That is your real surname, he says. And he's a vicar.
Yes.
He said, I wonder if he gets further up the C of E tree, he'd be called the Reverend Canon Mark Cannon.
I would. I've got more chance of winning the lottery, however.
Thank you. Ashley does make another point there, which I'll come on to next. Andrew.edwards@bbc.co.uk. So you're not worrying about becoming the Reverend Canon Mark Cannon anytime soon?
It's not going to happen.
Ashley, who, as well as asking whether you were going to become the Reverend Canon Mark Cannon if you progressed up the Church of England hierarchy, more seriously says, my experience of probate is horrid. Being an executor for my aunt's will, we'd not realised that will chasers were out there from charities she'd left money to. As soon as we started the probate part of the process, we were inundated by the charities screaming literally for their money. And Ashley wonders, is that normal?
It is normal. If you make a gift to charity in your will, once probate has been obtained, then the will is a public document, and obviously people searched wills to see if they've been left anything, and firms do this on behalf of charities, and as soon as charities are made aware, they will write to you or to your solicitor and say, when are we getting our money? But don't give in to the pressure, because do the job properly, and they have to wait.
And it's the last thing you want, frankly, at a time when things are tough often. Louise in Renthorpe, this is a very good question, Louise, on the text. 81333, Leeds at the start, says, how do people know we have a will? If anything were to happen to me and my husband together, do we just leave it in the house somewhere? Thank you, Louise in Renthorpe.
Depending on what you've put on your will, don't just leave it in the house. Imagine that you've got two children and you've excluded one from the will, and the other one's getting everything. And the one who's been excluded finds your will after your death and thinks, I'm not happy with this, and just shreds it. And there's no will at all then, and he and his sister take half each. So it is a problem because there's no central register of wills.
There should be, really, shouldn't there?
There should be. There are some private organisations who will register wills nationally, but they don't cover everybody. You could lodge your will with the court, but who thinks to look there?
What's your best advice?
Go to a solicitor.
I knew he'd say that. I knew he'd say that.
What we often do is where clients keep their own wills and they want to do that, we have a copy. So if anything does happen to your will or anything's lost or destroyed, there's always a copy. And only this morning I had a phone call from a lady who was phoning all the solicitors in Bradford to see if her mother had left a will with one of us.
And had you found it?
No.
We found my dad's in the tin box in the top of my mum's wardrobe, but it turned out to be out of date anyway. Thankfully, we got the up-to-date one. I'm Andrew. We are getting so many questions, which is great for our legal expert, Mark Cannon. But let's speak to Marjorie in Murfield next. 12 minutes to 3. Hello, Marjorie.
Hello.
Sorry to keep you waiting. How are you?
All right. Very well, thank you.
Good. What's your question for Mark, please?
My question is, I made a will. My husband and I both made mirror wills, as you say, quite a few years ago, but our family all live abroad. Are there any special instructions we should obey for grandchildren living abroad? They were only very young when we made it, but they're all in the teens or early 20s now.
I don't think there are any special instructions. Have you left the grandchildren something under your will?
We've left it in trust for them.
To what age? Are they past that age or forever?
I think it was 21.
Yeah, so I think as each...
Yeah,
I don't think it matters where they are. The will still take effect, and the grandchildren will still get what they are due when they reach the appropriate age.
Oh, I just wondered if, there was any different restrictions or laws for abroad.
Well, the value of the pound has dropped a bit.
That's a whole other phone in. Well, does that set your mind at rest, Marjorie?
Yes, it has,
Good.
actually, because sometimes countries, and you finish up paying extra taxes and things like that.
No, if you pay tax here, you shouldn't pay it
I
elsewhere as
just
well.
wondered if we should do anything about it.
Looks as though you're on the right track, Marjorie, which is a good thing, eh?
Thank you.
Really appreciate you listening, and thank you for the call, Marjorie. And thank you for getting the call in early. Even you hear me every afternoon saying, get your call in early, and you did, so I appreciate it, Marjorie.
Thank you very
much. Bye-bye. Marjorie in Murfield, 0345 303 3333. Dave in Huddersfield says, what is the difference? He's called to ask what's the difference between probate, the executor of a will, and the administrator of a will. Thank you, Dave.
If you're the executor of a will, you have been appointed as executor under that will, so you'll be named in the will as the executor and possibly trustee. If you are an administrator of somebody's estate, that means there has been no will, or a will that hasn't taken effect, or a will that hasn't appointed an executor. So an administrator does exactly the same job as an executor, but is appointed by the court to do so. So it's often where there is no will.
And probate?
Probate is the proving of the will or the estate, proving that that is the last will, and the court is happy that the executor can go ahead and distribute the assets according to that will.
A couple of people have a very similar question. Linda in Huddersfield. Hello, Linda. She texts me to say, this is 81333, Leeds at the start. Good afternoon, Andrew. As this is something I need to attend to, could I ask how much does it cost approximately to make a will? How long does it take? What's involved? And how much does it cost to make any alterations / additions? Linda in Huddersfield. And a very similar question from Annette in Saltaire, who called to say, how much does it cost to make a will?
I can go by our charges. So a single will is £120, a pair of mirror wills £180. To make an alteration, perhaps add a codicil a few years later, chopping out a grandchild or adding an executor or something like
Sounds
that.
painful.
It happens quite, especially after Christmas. We get lots of visitors. They didn't send me a Christmas card. He's out. So that may be £90 to £100.
So, the question of how long it takes, roughly speaking, Linda wonders.
In fact, if you instruct a solicitor to make a will, he's under quite a strict duty, or she's under a duty, to do it within 7 to 14 days, just in case anything happens to you.
And in terms of the appointment and sitting there and talking through it, what about that?
Half an hour to an hour.
As long as you've presumably thought about it before you turn up.
Yeah.
And in terms of what is involved, what is involved? If Linda turned up and said, I want to make a will, what would be involved?
We would want a full picture of assets and liabilities, so we could advise on things like inheritance tax, for example. We'd want a full picture of marriages and divorces and children and who's related to who, so we're trying to ensure that you don't miss anybody out that you should miss out, or alternatively, you can miss somebody out who you want to miss out. So a picture of your whole life, really, in some ways.
And I'm going to squeeze in Sue in Whitkirk, who emails me right at the end of this to say, hi, Andrew, my question is, how many executors do you need for a will? If one of them dies before me, what happens then? If an executor is the solicitor, does it cost a lot of money? And Sue is in Whitkirk, emailing andrew.edwards@bbc.co.uk.
Yes, you can have 4 executors to prove a will. You could appoint under your will 6, but only 4 would actually be named on the grant.
And what's the minimum?
1. But of course, you're right. It's a risk. If that one person dies, then that bit of the will doesn't.
And you
really
could
work.
Presumably have a solicitor as an executor.
If you have a solicitor as an executor, and sometimes there are good reasons for that, where the family's falling out and you need a referee, for example. But if you appoint a solicitor, then when it comes to probate, there will be charges for the solicitor acting for you.
So I hope that's answered your question, and I hope if you got your question in and we've not had time for it, that there'll be another opportunity. I have to say, I've really enjoyed your company this afternoon, Mark, and
thank you.
We've got till the end of November if you want to take advantage of Will Aid, which a number of solicitors, and Applebys in Bradford clearly are one of them, if you want to get involved with that. Mark Cannon, nice to meet you, Mark. Thank you very much indeed. Our death specialist, as he said. Vicar and wills, covers it all.